I think most Catholics can admit that we have a serious deficit of understanding in the church, which is why a lot of Catholics just don't know the essential basics of what we believe, let alone some of the more neglected teachings of the church. This is also compounded by the fact that every generation has like their pet virtues and pet ideas that are trendy, basically, and that they tend to nurture while neglecting certain other ones that are less popular. Which is why C.S. Lewis said that if you have to decide between reading new books and old books, you should choose the old books because they will contain wisdom that is often neglected by the contemporary age that you live in. And this has definitely been my experience of reading older Catholic books and teachings and like magisterial texts. In my experience, it has been like rediscovering Catholicism all over again because we definitely have fallen prey to the temptation to neglect what other generations have emphasized as critically important teachings, either because they accuse us of vices that are common today and therefore would easily offend us, or because we're too at home in the world, something Jesus warned us not to let happen. And in my experience, you really only have two ways of avoiding this narrow understanding of your faith. Either you pick up old books and you start studying, or you benefit from modern media that will help catechize you in teachings you are otherwise unfamiliar with, because you won't hear these things discussed in a homily or a typical parish-run catechetical program. In my experience, a lot of the times I was introduced to these kinds of teachings and concepts or these neglected teachings was through podcasts and YouTube channels and Catholic Answers Radio and things like that. So that's why I'm aiming to contribute some of that in my efforts. I also want to just mention quickly before we get into them that I had planned on doing a list of about 5 or so teachings, but it turned out to be just way too long. So I've reduced the number to 3 teachings. But if you like this video and you would like more examples, let me know and I'll plan on doing another video like this. Okay, so number 1 is usury. According to the Council of Trent, usury is defined as whatever is received above the capital and principal of some economic transaction, be it money or really anything of value. It's popularly thought of as lending money with interest, and while that's an oversimplification, under certain conditions, that's exactly what it is, which is why it's such an unfamiliar teaching, because today it seems like everyone, even the institutions of the church, are basically doing it. And because our entire economy seems to be based on this kind of monetary policy, and because everybody is embroiled in it in one way or another, it's like the church is too embarrassed to candidly talk about it. So we just don't. I'd be willing to bet that most Catholics have never even heard that word. And that's more than a little frustrating because that's actually a very serious sin, something akin to extortion, often by someone in a position of power and wealth against someone who is poor and vulnerable, which goes against just about everything that Jesus taught. But we don't need God to tell us that it's wrong. The ancient pagans believed it was wrong too. In the simplest of terms, it's a violation of justice because it's the sale or lending of something that doesn't exist and then expecting compensation for it. So I get that that probably sounds weird, so let me try to explain this in more detail. Any transaction of goods should involve the exchange of things of equal or similar value. It should be fair in simplest terms. Both participants should be compensated justly within that transaction. If we can all agree to that, then the same should be true of money. If I lend you $10, then I should get $10 in return. That's the balancing of the scales. But if I expect more in return, then I'm expecting more than I gave to that transaction. To say that I'll lend you $10 and you'll pay me back $15 at your expense is obviously a disproportionate exchange, and the only way that I can make such a demand is if I'm in a position of power and you are in a position of vulnerability or even desperation. But it also requires that I'm making a demand upon some good that doesn't exist. I'm basically selling you the $10, which is the principal, which you then receive, and then I'm also renting you the extra $5. That would be like me selling you a book, which if I sold it to you, you would then own, right? But then I send you a bill for a rental fee for the book too. How can I rent you a book that you own? I'm effectively selling it twice. But there aren't 2 books, there's just the one book. So I'm trying to earn money off of something that basically doesn't exist. The same is true of the money exchange. The $5 I'm demanding from you never was mine. I'm demanding the return of something that never existed in my balance sheet and That's obviously dishonest. The Council of Trent, again, says, "He who lends at usury sells the same thing twice, or sells that which has no real existence." The Second Lateran Council in 1139 said this: "We condemn the practice accounted despicable and blameworthy by divine and human laws, namely the ferocious greed of usurers, and we sever them from every comfort of the church. Let them be held infamous throughout their whole lives." So, wow. The church doesn't just teach it's wrong, it teaches that anyone who does it should be treated with the utmost contempt possible. That's pretty serious, and given the gravity of it, you'd think we'd be warned about it as often as possible. But, at least in my experience, we aren't. And some people, especially those who are constantly holding out hope for progressive developments in the church, think that that's because the church changed her teaching on it, and therefore she can change other teachings. Others claim that the modern economy is such a different kind of thing that what we call lending on interest today is different from what they were talking about at the time of, say, the Council of Trent or Lateran II. And I think both of those answers, certainly the first one is wrong. The second one is probably right, but it needs more explanation. Historically, like in the modern ages, money was something with definite and stable value, in part because it was minted from actual pieces of metal, sometimes precious metals like silver or gold or bronze or whatever, and that had a value according to the mass of the metal used in the coin. So it was much more explicit when someone was expecting a return greater than the principal. There's no debating that 3 silver coins is worth more than 2 silver coins, and I shouldn't expect 3 back for the 2 I contributed to the transaction. But currency in today's economic system is much more abstract and fluid, that it's harder to define when usury occurs and when it's just some sort of like accounting sorcery that could arguably still be a just exchange. And I don't know if this is accurate, so take it with a grain of salt, but it has been explained to me by my banking and economist friends that when a bank lends you money, they only need to have like 10% of it as money that they actually possess in their accounts. The other 90% of the loan is created in the process of them lending you the money. They're just conjuring it out of thin air and then giving it to you as buying power out in our market, which does all kinds of crazy things to our economy, not the least of which is inflation of our currency. This is called fractional reserve banking. And if that's actually how it works, then that seems to me to be exactly what is described by the fathers and the councils when they say usury is selling something that doesn't exist or selling something twice, and then expecting to be compensated for something you never gave in the first place. And because our modern financial system is such a theater of illusion, it seems like the church isn't confident enough to pinpoint what is and isn't usury without saying, oh, it's just excessive interest on loans. But that's not what Trent defines it as. And now that we're so dependent on it, it would be too hard to untangle ourselves from it. But I think any reasonable person would agree that we would be spared a lot of misery if this wasn't the de facto of our banking and financial system today. Okay, number 2, I remember being really shocked by this one, which is that you aren't a person after you die. So most people seem to think that death is some kind of liberation from this crude material existence into like a pure and beautiful spiritual existence, which is what we're meant to be, like angels, for example. Actually, it seems that quite a few people think that we actually become angels when we die, but we don't. Angels are entirely different in nature from us. Human beings and human persons are body-soul composites. What makes us human is the fact that we are this kind of composite. We are material like animals, but we have a rational soul and a will like God. That's in part how we are made in His image. And because it is a rational soul, it survives death. This is actually something that even ancient pagans like Aristotle and Plato came to believe by reason. They inferred that because the human intellect is able to apprehend like spaceless and timeless realities like mathematical truths that we don't need our physical senses to know about, therefore our intellect itself must have some share in spaceless and timeless reality. Therefore, when the body dies, it survives. So what exactly survives if it's not a human person? It's our intellect and will. St. Thomas describes it like this: the soul is not the whole human being, but only a part of the human being. And therefore, though the soul can exist apart from the body, a human being cannot. And this is why the soul is not called a human being. So what survives death the death of the body, is a disembodied soul, not a full human person, which is why, as our creed states, we look forward to the resurrection in which we will receive glorified bodies and a restoration of our whole humanity. Heaven, as we perceive it, as like a place of rest for souls after death, is not our final destination or existence, and we shouldn't want it to be. It will only be fragmentary. Okay, number 3 is that the ends or purpose, if you prefer, of the conjugal act in marriage is procreation. So if you came of age as a fledgling Catholic in the era of theology of the body, like I did, then you will have heard over and over again that the purpose of sex is the twofold procreation and union of the spouses, which is that it's true. But if that's all that is said, then that's not the whole truth, because these two ends are not equal. Going all the way back to St. Augustine, up until the Middle Ages with St. Thomas, and all the way up to this through the centuries in canon law and the theological manuals, until it was synthesized by Pope Pius XI in his encyclical Casti Connubii, it was taught that the primary purpose of the conjugal act is procreation, and that the secondary ends are the mutual love of spouses and the relief of concupiscence, which isn't something I was clearly taught in the theology of the body days, even though I took a lot of interest in trying to learn and understand the topic as someone who was about to get married, with both my wife and I being recent converts who really wanted to get this right. Concupiscence being another word that you don't hear much today in the church. So concupiscence describes our fallen passions, which direct us towards sin. It's like this gravitational pull towards evil. In the case of our sexual appetites, we are tempted towards lust. But marriage, going all the way back to the Bible, was described as like a relief for those passions, a way to direct them towards a good rather than sin. That good being procreation and marital love. But again, procreation is primary and marital love secondary. And I think a confusion that a lot of people have is that either of these goods will do. So I can frustrate the procreative side by using something like natural family planning, like a natural form of contraception, to effectively avoid procreation at all costs. And it doesn't matter, because we're still honoring the other purpose, which is our marital union. But the unitive ends are subordinate to the procreative. The unitive are secondary and the procreative primary. Every conjugal act, not just the marriage in general, but every act has to be open to life and procreation. Now, that doesn't mean that every time spouses come together that they should get pregnant. That would be absurd, of course. But it does mean that we can't persist in a pattern of avoiding pregnancy at all costs without persistent, serious reasons. So Pius does admit that in cases of economic necessity or health, couples can remain abstinent during periods of fertility to avoid pregnancy, but that such circumstances should be with serious motives. But then he leaves it up to us to decide what constitutes serious motives. So those are 3 that I can think of, and I can think of a lot more. But if you can think of some, I'd love to read them in the comments below. Okay, thanks for watching. These videos and this channel are only possible because of viewer support. So if you can spare some help, please consider making a contribution through my website at brianholdsworth.ca, or join my locals community at brianholdsworth.locals.com, where you can interact with myself and other like-minded individuals. We actually just started a monthly Zoom meetup where we're studying some articles of St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa. So if that's interesting to you, then come join us there. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe.